There are names that transcend the concept of movie star to become part of world cultural history. And Al Pacino is one of them. For more than half a century, he has built a career that very few artists in Hollywood history can match. Pacino is the one who brought one of the greatest characters in cinema, Michael Corleone, in the masterpiece The Godfather and its sequels, where his cold yet deeply introspective performance redefined the art of acting on screen. Not long after, he created another pop culture icon with the role of Tony Montana in Scarface, a character that has become legendary in the history of gangster films. Over a career spanning more than 50 years, Pacino has received 9 Oscar nominations and ultimately won the Best Actor Oscar for his role in Scent of a Woman. He has also won multiple Golden Globes, BAFTAs, Emmys, and Tonys, becoming one of the very few performers to achieve the Triple Crown of acting, the highest honor in acting, by winning an Oscar, an Emmy, and a Tony. The films featuring Pacino have grossed billions of dollars worldwide, and the American Film Institute ranks him among the greatest screen legends of all time. To hundreds of millions of audiences, Pacino is not just an actor, but the standard of cinematic acting. But behind the awards, the applause, and the spotlight lies a very different story, the story of a man who has had to fight his entire life just to survive. Before becoming a Hollywood icon, Pacino was just a poor kid growing up on the harsh streets of the Bronx, where violence and deprivation were everyday realities. He lost his mother at 21, a shock that nearly destroyed his life and plunged him into years of loneliness and being lost. There were times Pacino drowned in alcohol and self-doubt, fearing his acting dream would end before it truly began. Even after becoming famous, he faced periods of career decline, criticized roles, and moments when it seemed Hollywood had turned its back on him. Pacino once lost millions of dollars due to financial betrayal and stood on the brink of losing everything he had built. But what makes his story special is not just the dazzling successes, but the ability to rise after every fall. Because behind the face of Michael Corleone or Tony Montana is a man who has stepped out of the darkness of his own life many times, carrying wounds the audience never sees, and turning them into strength to keep going. It is that willpower, not just talent, that has made Al Pacino a legend. If the story of Al Pacino moves you, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring life journeys like this one. When the lights of Hollywood had not yet entered his life, Al Pacino was just a little boy born on April 25, 1940 in East Harlem, New York, a poor neighborhood where dreams were often crushed before they could even form. No red carpets, no cameras, just crowded streets and working-class families struggling day by day to survive. His parents, Salvatore Pacino and Rose Gherardi, were Italian-Americans carrying hopes of a better life in the new country. But that hope quickly shattered. When Pacino was only 2 years old, their marriage fell apart. His father left, leaving a void the boy could almost never fill. Pacino and his mother moved in with his grandparents in the South Bronx, a harsh neighborhood where poverty and crime were so familiar that people almost stopped noticing them. Nights in the Bronx were never truly quiet. Police sirens tore through the darkness, arguments echoed from thin-walled apartments, and sometimes the sounds of street fights rang out. Rose-bold, cramped brick buildings housed immigrant families trying to get by. In tiny rooms where sunlight rarely reached, Pacino grew up amid deprivations many other children never had to face. No money for summer vacations, no new toys, sometimes not even peace. But amid all those hardships, there was one person who always looked at Pacino with trusting eyes: his mother, Rose Gherardi. She wasn't a strong woman in the way the world often praises. She was fragile, sensitive, and carried her own private sorrows that the young Pacino couldn't fully understand at the time. Rose once dreamed of becoming an artist, loved movies and theater in a way few people in their neighborhood cared about. She often took her son to the movies, and in the darkness of the theater, young Pacino first saw another world, a world where people could become anyone, where stories could be bigger than the hard life outside the theater doors. But that small hope was always overshadowed by dark clouds. Rose Girardi struggled with illness and long bouts of depression. There were days she barely left her bed. There were days her sadness made the room feel so heavy that young Pacino felt like he was breathing in an overly cramped space. He loved his mother, but he also soon realized he couldn't save her from the shadows surrounding her. And while other kids talked about family as a safe haven, Pacino grew up feeling he didn't truly belong anywhere. Not to the streets where violence was normal, not to the classrooms where he was often seen as the odd kid out. And sometimes, even in his own small home, he felt like an outsider. That feeling, that sense of being left behind, of not being seen, followed Pacino through his childhood years. But it was in that very loneliness that something quietly began to form, a desire to be seen, a desire to be heard, a desire to become someone bigger than the poor boy in the Bronx neighborhood. And though he didn't know it then, those deep emotions, the pain, the loneliness, and the will to survive would later become the energy that the whole world would marvel at on screen. The years of deprivation in the Bronx not only left Al Pacino with a feeling of loneliness, but also pushed him into a dangerous, rebellious phase as he entered his teenage years. In the South Bronx of the 1950s, the line between a normal boy and a lost soul was almost non-existent. Just one wrong step, and life could veer onto a path from which no one ever returns. Pacino at that time was not a model student. He frequently got into trouble at school, talked back to teachers, and gradually lost interest in studying. The cramped classrooms, the dry lectures, and the harsh life outside made everything feel meaningless to him. Finally, at around 17 years old, he dropped out. That was not an impulsive decision made in a moment, but the result of many years of feeling he didn't belong in that world. After leaving school, Pacino began spending more time on the streets where he grew up. He hung out with street youths, people just like him, young, angry, and unable to see any future ahead. They wandered through dark alleys, smoked, laughed loudly, and tried to act tough in a world always ready to swallow the weak. Pacino started smoking very early. Alcohol quickly became part of his life too. It wasn't fancy parties, just cheap bottles passed around in dimly lit street corners. For many in Pacino's group of friends, those years were the beginning of a very different path. Some ended up getting arrested later. Some went to prison. Some disappeared from the neighborhood with no one knowing where they went. Pacino later looked back on that period and said that just one more wrong move, and his life could have been exactly like theirs. No one in the neighborhood believed that the skinny kid with messy hair would become a Hollywood legend. Even Pacino himself didn't think so at the time. He was just trying to survive day by day. But amid all those dark paths, a small door began to open. It was the stage. Pacino first encountered acting when he joined a small theater group. At first, it was just a way to escape the streets for a few hours. But when he stood on stage, something strange happened. For the first time in his life, Pacino felt seen. The emotions he had carried since childhood, the sadness, the anger, the feeling of being abandoned, all found a place to exist. On stage, they were no longer burdens. They became strength. While his friends continued to roam the streets, Pacino began spending more time in cramped rehearsal rooms where dim lights shone down on old wooden floors. There, Pacino learned to turn pain into art. He learned to listen, observe, and understand people skills that would later amaze audiences around the world. But at that point, everything was still very fragile. Pacino was still poor. He was still lost. And the road ahead was full of uncertainty. Only one thing was certain. The stage had given the boy from the Bronx a reason not to go back to the dark path that so many of his friends had taken. And sometimes, in a life full of ups and downs, just one reason like that is enough to change everything. But sometimes, just as a glimmer of hope appears, life tests a person in the cruelest way. In 1962, when Al Pacino was only 21 years old, the biggest tragedy of his life occurred. His mother, Rose Girardi, the only person who always believed that the skinny boy from the Bronx could become an artist, passed away. Her death came like an unexpected storm, sweeping away the last spiritual anchor in Pacino's life. Throughout his impoverished childhood and the lost years of his youth, his mother had always been the only one who saw something special in him. She was not just a mother. She was the only one who believed Pacino could become more than a boy from the harsh streets of the South Bronx. And when she left, Pacino felt as though the most important part of himself had vanished with her. That shock nearly brought him to complete collapse. Pacino didn't just lose his mother, he lost his direction. Theater rehearsals gradually became fewer. The acting dreams that had once kept him away from a life of crime began to feel distant. In the pain he didn't know how to face, Pacino turned to alcohol. At first it was just a few drinks to numb the emptiness, but gradually it became a dangerous habit. He drank more and more, as if trying to deaden the simmering pain inside. His friends began to notice that Pacino was no longer the passionate young man who once talked about the stage with bright eyes. He became quiet, depressed, and often disappeared from rehearsals. There were nights he wandered the cold streets of New York with no idea where he was going. The city at that time was not the symbol of opportunity people often imagine. For Pacino, it was a maze of dim lights, small bars, and street corners where one could easily be swallowed by loneliness. There were times he barely had a place to stay. Pacino crashed on friends' sofas in cramped rooms, sometimes even sleeping in makeshift spots just to get out of the cold wind. At one point, he lived like a homeless person in the very city that would later honor him as a legend. The acting dreams that had once kept him standing began to feel fragile. Pacino later admitted that during that period, he truly believed his life had ended before it could even begin. He looked around and saw his old friends from the Bronx, those who had slid into crime or vanished into the prison system, and sometimes he wondered if he was heading toward the same end, just a little slower, waking up in the mornings with hangovers from drinking. Pacino often felt like he was drifting in a boundless ocean. No mother, no money, no clear future, just a vast cold city. But deep inside him, something had not died. It was the memory of the evenings his mother took him to the movies, the memory of the stage lights first shining on his face when he was still a boy trying to find his place in this world. Those memories, though faint, still quietly existed, and it was they that kept Pacino from falling completely into the darkness. But at that time, he didn't yet know that those painful years were not the end of his life. They were only the opening chapter of a journey that the whole world would later look back on in amazement. Because sometimes, before a legend is born, life has to break that person to the very core. But it was precisely from the depths of that despair that a quiet decision began to change Al Pacino's life. After the months of drowning in alcohol and feeling lost following his mother's death, Pacino gradually realized that if he didn't hold on to something to keep living, his life would drift away just like so many other young people in the Bronx, vanishing into poverty, dead-end jobs, or worse, prison. And the only thing still smoldering inside him was acting. So, even though he had almost no money and no one guaranteeing his future, Pacino decided to pursue that path to the end. He found his way to what would later become a legend in American acting history, the Actors Studio. There, Pacino studied under the guidance of one of the greatest masters of method acting, Lee Strasberg. Strasberg didn't teach acting in the conventional way. He forced his students to dig deep into their own memories, pain, and personal experiences to create real emotion on stage. For many, that method was uncomfortable, but for Pacino, it was like discovering a new language to express everything he had been through. The pain from his childhood in the Bronx, His mother's death, the prolonged loneliness over so many years, all of it began to become fuel for his art. But studying acting didn't make Pacino's life any easier. In fact, the 1960s were the harshest years of his life. Hollywood at that time had no idea who Al Pacino was. To the world, he was just a skinny young man with dreams far too big for his circumstances. Pacino auditioned over and over, and over and over and over. He was rejected. Directors said he was too short, too thin, his face too unusual. Some even told him outright that he didn't have the face of a star. Each rejection felt like a small cut into his confidence, but Pacino had no other choice but to keep going. To survive in an expensive city like New York, he took whatever jobs he could find. For a time, Pacino worked as a doorman for a small building, standing for hours in the cold just to earn enough to pay rent. When that job ended, he became a messenger, delivering mail across neighborhoods, while his mind stayed on the roles he had never gotten a chance to play. At one point, he waited tables in a restaurant, carrying heavy trays through the fancy dining rooms of people whose lives he could only imagine. But even those jobs weren't stable. There were days Pacino had almost no money in his pocket. Some evenings he had to choose between buying a hot meal or saving for rent. There were days he truly had nothing to eat, but strangely, even in his hardest moments, Pacino never gave up on his dream. He kept going to small theater rehearsals, kept stepping onto cramped off-Broadway stages where audiences sometimes numbered only on one hand. There was no money, no fame, just dim lights and other struggling artists like him trying to believe their art mattered. And every time Pacino stepped on stage, he felt something familiar, that this was where he belonged. His friends sometimes asked why he kept going when everything seemed against him. Pacino simply answered that he didn't know what else to do. Acting was no longer a choice. It had become the only way he could survive. Those years of hunger, rejection, and odd jobs could have broken many people. But for Pacino, they quietly forged him. Each failure made him understand people more deeply. Each difficult day taught him patience. And little by little, the poor boy from the Bronx began turning his wounds into what the world would later call acting genius. But at that time, Pacino was still just an unknown name trying to survive in New York. He didn't know that just a few years later, a role would come along, one that would change not only his life, but the history of Hollywood itself. But sometimes in life, after long years spent in darkness, just one single opportunity can change everything. For Al Pacino, that opportunity came in the early 1970s, when a major film project was being prepared in Hollywood. The movie was called The Godfather, a story of power, family, and the mafia world based on Mario Puzo's famous novel. Today, the film is regarded as one of the greatest masterpieces in cinema history, but back then, no one knew for sure what it would become. And certainly no one thought that an unknown actor like Pacino would be at the center of that story. The only person who saw something special in Pacino was the film's director, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola had seen Pacino perform on stage and was immediately struck by the way he conveyed emotion, something both intense and subtle. In Coppola's mind, Pacino was the perfect choice for Michael Corleone, the youngest son of the mafia family, a quiet young man, initially standing outside the criminal world, but gradually turning into one of its coldest bosses. But the problem was, Coppola was almost the only one who thought so. Paramount Pictures opposed it fiercely. To them, Pacino didn't look like a movie star. He was too short. He didn't have the glamorous look Hollywood usually loved. And most importantly, he was virtually unknown. The producers wanted bigger names, familiar faces to audiences like Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, or Jack Nicholson. They believed only stars like that could draw crowds to theaters. Meanwhile, Pacino was just a skinny stage actor with a few small screen roles. Throughout the production, Pacino lived in near constant fear of being replaced. Every day on set felt like a test. If a scene wasn't convincing enough, the producers immediately pressured Coppola to find someone else. There were moments Pacino truly thought he would be fired before the film was finished. Those days brought back all the years of rejection, the failed auditions, the taunts that he didn't have the face of a star. But Coppola never changed his mind. He believed Pacino was Michael Corleone. And over time, as the film came together, people began to see what Coppola had seen from the start. Pacino didn't need glamour. He brought the character a different power silence, tension, and a cold gaze that held viewers captive. When the film finally premiered in 1972, what happened was almost unbelievable. The Godfather didn't just succeed, it became a cultural phenomenon. Audiences across America flocked to theaters. The lines, the scenes, and especially the character of Michael Corleone quickly became legendary. And along with the film, the name Al Pacino suddenly became known around the world. In one night, the boy who once slept on friends' sofas, who once worked as a messenger and waiter to survive in New York, became one of the most talked-about faces in Hollywood. Pacino received his first Oscar nomination for that role, and from that moment, cinema history changed forever. But what makes the story special isn't just the film's success. What makes it extraordinary is how close Pacino came to not being in it at all. If Coppola hadn't fought so hard to keep him, if the studio had succeeded in replacing him, the world might never have known Michael Corleone as we know him today, and perhaps the name Al Pacino would have remained just another unknown actor among thousands who once dreamed of Hollywood. But sometimes fate stands with those who have endured the longest. After years of poverty, rejection, and doubt, Pacino finally stepped into the light. And from that moment, a legend was born. The success of The Godfather changed everything in Al Pacino's life almost overnight. Just a few months earlier, he was still a poor stage actor in New York, someone who slept on friends' sofas and worried about what he would eat the next day. But now, the name Al Pacino appeared on the front pages of film magazines, on movie posters, and in the conversations of millions of audiences. Hollywood had found a new face, an actor who could silence an audience with just a glance. Success followed success. Pacino returned to the role of Michael Corleone in the sequel to The Godfather, and that performance further cemented his place in cinema history. He received Oscar nominations, was praised by critics, and was regarded as one of the finest actors of his generation. To audiences, Pacino seemed to be living the dream any actor would crave. But behind the doors of fame, his life was far from the peaceful one people imagined. Fame came too fast, too powerfully, and brought pressures Pacino had never prepared to face. The streets where he once walked anonymously were no longer the same. Every time he stepped out, Pacino realized every eye was on him. Cameras flashed non-stop. Paparazzi waited outside restaurants, theaters, even his apartment. Strangers wanted autographs, wanted photos, wanted to touch the man they had just seen on screen. For many stars, that was the reward of success. But for Pacino, it felt like an invisible cage. He was a private, almost shy man in real life. The overwhelming attention made him feel suffocated. He began avoiding big parties, avoiding the glamorous Hollywood events. Instead of enjoying fame, Pacino often felt like he was standing on the sidelines, watching it all from afar. And the more famous he became, the lonelier he felt. The paradox of fame is that it can make one person known to millions, yet truly understood by no one. Pacino began spending more time alone. In quiet hotel rooms after long days of filming, he often reflected on how drastically his life had changed. Just a few years earlier, he worried about rent. Now he lived amid the lights of Hollywood. But that change brought no peace. Instead, it made Pacino feel like he was gradually losing control of his life. The pressure from success began weighing heavily on him. Every new role was compared to Michael Corleone. Every film had to prove that Pacino wasn't just a flash in the pan. Those expectations made him more tense than ever, and like many artists before him, Pacino began turning to alcohol to soothe the emotions he didn't know how to handle. At first, it was just a few drinks after a long day on set, but gradually, alcohol became a familiar habit. It helped him temporarily forget the pressure, temporarily forget the lights and expectations that followed him, but it also pulled him into a dangerous spiral. Pacino once said there were times in his life when he felt like he was living in a storm with no way to stop it. The success he had dreamed of during his years of poverty now carried an indescribable unease. He wondered if he truly deserved all of this. He wondered if one day it could all vanish as quickly as it had appeared. And deep down, Pacino was still the boy from the Bronx, the boy who once felt he belonged nowhere. Fame could change how the world saw him, but it couldn't erase those memories. So even while standing at the peak of Hollywood, Pacino still carried a fragile feeling, as if everything could collapse at any moment. And what makes his story so heartbreaking is exactly that. While the whole world saw a star shining brightly, the man behind the lights was quietly fighting himself. Amid all the pressures of fame and the growing loneliness, Al Pacino once had something he believed could save him from that whirlwind: love. During the filming of The Godfather, Pacino met a talented young actress named Diane Keaton. On screen, they played a complicated couple, Michael Corleone and Kay Adams, a man sinking deeper into the criminal world, and the woman trying to hold on to whatever humanity remained in him. But off-screen, during those long days on set, a real connection began to form. Keaton was drawn to Pacino in a way few people understood. He wasn't the glamorous Hollywood star type. He was quiet, introspective, sometimes almost shy. But behind that silence was an emotional depth that made Keaton feel he was different from every man she had ever met. And Pacino, who always felt out of place in the world of fame, found in Keaton a rare gentleness and understanding. In the early years of their relationship, they shared dreams and fears with each other. Keaton believed Pacino was not only a great actor, but a man searching for a place to belong, and for a time it seemed they could truly be each other's refuge. But fame is an uncontrollable force, and it began to creep between them. As Pacino's career exploded, his life grew more chaotic. Constant travel, new film projects, interviews, and media attention left him with little time for a normal life. Meanwhile, Keaton began thinking about a different future, a more stable one. She wanted a family. She wanted marriage. She wanted a home where life wasn't dictated by filming schedules and long, lonely nights. But Pacino, carrying all the wounds from his past, feared exactly those things. He feared commitment. He feared that marriage would take away the freedom he had fought so long to gain. And deep down, he also carried another worry: the fear that he didn't know how to be a good husband. Pacino grew up in a broken family. His father left when he was too young. The image of a lasting family barely existed in his memory. So when Keaton started talking about marriage, Pacino didn't see safety. He saw fear. Their relationship gradually became fragile. Keaton later said there were times she felt like she was waiting for something Pacino could never give. She loved him, but love couldn't survive forever in hesitation and silence. In the end, the inevitable happened. Their relationship ended. For Keaton, it was a painful but necessary decision to move forward with her life. But for Pacino, that breakup felt like another door closing in a life already full of losses. When Keaton left, Pacino once again faced the familiar feeling of being left behind. He kept working, kept making films, kept receiving applause from audiences. But in quiet moments, when the stage lights went out and the room grew silent, Pacino felt his loneliness deeper than ever. Fame had given him everything the boy from the Bronx once dreamed of: money, recognition, power in Hollywood. But it couldn't keep the woman he loved. And sometimes, in the long nights of New York City, Pacino began to realize a heartbreaking truth. The greater he became in the eyes of the world, the smaller he felt in his own private life. South CPT working kept standing in front of the camera, but inside, Pacino carried an anger and loneliness that few people recognized. And then, in the early 1980s, a role appeared, one that seemed to be made from the very intense emotions raging inside him. The film was called Scarface. In the movie, Pacino played Tony Montana, a Cuban immigrant arriving in Miami with nothing but unlimited ambition. Tony Montana was no hero. He was brutal, hot-tempered, greedy, and willing to destroy everything to gain power. But it was that very intensity that made the character unforgettable. From the very first scenes, Pacino brought an almost explosive energy to the role. The raspy voice, the icy stare, the sudden bursts of rage. Tony Montana wasn't just a character. He was a storm, and many people later realized that some part of that storm reflected Pacino's own state of mind in real life. Those years, Pacino didn't always feel at peace. Fame, pressure, and personal losses left him with a quiet rebellion inside. Tony Montana, with all his anger and loneliness, became the place where Pacino poured out that energy. When he stood in front of the camera, he wasn't just acting. He was living the character. He spent months studying Tony Montana's voice, walk, and psychology to create someone both terrifying and magnetic. But when Scarface premiered in 1983, the initial reaction wasn't what many expected. The film was criticized for excessive violence. Some critics said it was too dark, too extreme. Pacino, who had poured his heart into the role, once again faced the familiar criticisms from Hollywood. But what the critics didn't see at the time was the film's lasting power. Over time, Scarface began to find its audience. Young people were drawn to the story of ambition, power, and downfall. Tony Montana's lines became iconic, the scenes became legendary, and Pacino, with his ferocious performance, created one of the most iconic characters in cinema history. Tony Montana wasn't just a gangster on screen. He became a pop culture symbol, appearing in music, fashion, and countless works of art afterward. But what made that role special wasn't just the film's fame. It was the fact that Tony Montana carried a profound loneliness. Despite having power, money, and an entire criminal empire, Tony was still a solitary man, surrounded by enemies and doubt. And as the film reached its end, the character collapsed in the very world he had built. Years later, looking back on Scarface, Pacino said that Tony Montana was a tragic figure, a man always fighting the world, but ultimately losing to himself. Perhaps that's why the role resonated so powerfully with audiences, because beneath the gunfire and brutality, Scarface is a story about ambition, about loneliness, and about the price people pay when they try to become something bigger than themselves. And for Pacino, that role marked another important milestone in his career. Once again, he proved he wasn't just Michael Corleone. He was an actor capable of creating fierce, complex, haunting characters. But at the same time, Scarface also reflected an unspoken truth. Even as Pacino created legends on screen, his private life continued to battle shadows that no one but him could see. But Hollywood history has always had a cruel rule. Fame can lift a person to the top, but it can also turn its back on them in an instant. After the huge success of Scarface, many believed Al Pacino's career would keep soaring without stop. He had created two iconic cinema characters, Michael Corleone and Tony Montana, and it seemed nothing could shake his place in Hollywood. But in 1985, an unexpected fall happened. Pacino starred in Revolution, a big historical project about the American Revolution. The film was lavishly produced, shot in harsh conditions, and carried high expectations. Pacino put tremendous heart into the role, believing it would be an important work in his career. But when Revolution premiered, the reaction from audiences and critics was almost brutal. The film was poorly received, It bombed at the box office, and the criticism started aiming straight at Pacino. Some critics said he had lost the sharpness that once made his name. Others said Pacino no longer fit the rapidly changing Hollywood. For an actor once considered a genius, those comments felt like cold knives. Hollywood is a harsh place with a very short memory. Past victories are quickly forgotten when a major failure appears. And for the first time in many years, Pacino felt as though the film world was turning its back on him. But what made this fall more painful wasn't just the film's failure. It touched a deep fear Pacino had always carried, the fear that everything he had achieved could vanish at any moment. After Revolution, Pacino began withdrawing from Hollywood. No big film projects, no glamorous premieres, no noisy interviews. He almost disappeared from the screen for nearly 4 years. To audiences, that absence felt like a strange silence. To Hollywood, it seemed like a sign that an era had ended. During those years, many began saying Pacino was finished. New faces appeared in cinema. Young stars took over the screen. And the name that once commanded the world's attention was mentioned less and less. But Pacino didn't completely disappear. He returned to where it all began, the theater stage. In small theaters far from Hollywood's lights, Pacino rediscovered his original passion for acting. No cameras, no box office pressure, just audiences and stories told live on stage. For many, stepping away from film at that point felt like admitting defeat. But for Pacino, it was a way to survive. He needed distance. He needed time to remember why he started acting in the first place. Those years weren't easy. Pacino had to face the world's doubt and the questions inside himself. He had once stood at the peak of Hollywood, once been called one of the greatest actors of his generation. And now he was performing on theater stages, far from the spotlight he once had. But it was in that silence that something important happened. Pacino began rebuilding himself, not as a movie star, but as a true artist. He dug deeper into acting, studied characters, and rediscovered the authenticity he had brought in the early days of his career. And though many at the time believed Pacino's story was over, they didn't know that this silent period was only preparation for one of the greatest comebacks in Hollywood history. Because sometimes, before a legend rises again, life has to force them through years when the whole world believes they have vanished. But sometimes in life, the longest silences are exactly the preparation for an explosive moment. After nearly 4 years away from Hollywood, many believed Al Pacino's career was slowly coming to a close. New generations of actors emerged, new films dominated the box office, and the name Pacino no longer appeared regularly on the big screen. For an industry that always chases the new like Hollywood, such a prolonged silence almost meant being forgotten. But those who truly understood Pacino knew he had never stopped being an artist. Throughout the years away from film, he continued acting in theater, studying characters, and rediscovering his original passion for performing. And then, in the early 1990s, a role appeared, one that seemed destined to bring him back into the light. The film was called Scent of a Woman. In the movie, Pacino played Frank Slade, a blind former army officer, bitter and angry at life. Frank Slade was a man carrying deep pain, pride, and profound emotional wounds. He could be rude, abrasive, and full of sarcasm. But behind that shell was a person struggling with his own despair. When Pacino took on the role, many didn't know what would happen. He had been absent from the big screen for too long. Hollywood doesn't always forgive long periods of silence easily. But from the very first scenes, something familiar returned. Pacino didn't just play Frank Slade, he became Frank Slade. The powerful voice, every small gesture, every moment of silence carried an emotional depth that held audiences captive. And then came a scene that went down in cinema history, Frank Slade's speech before the school's disciplinary board. In that scene, Pacino stood up, his voice low but weighted with power, defending a young boy from the injustice of the adult world. It wasn't just a character's monologue in the film. For many viewers, it felt like Pacino's own declaration to Hollywood that he was still here. When Scent of a Woman premiered in 1992, audiences and critics were captivated. The film succeeded, but what people talked about most was Pacino's performance. After years of ups and downs, he once again proved why he was considered one of the greatest actors of his generation. And at the Oscars ceremony that year, the moment Pacino had waited for over decades finally arrived. After 7 previous nominations, he won the Oscar for Best Actor. When Pacino stepped onto the stage to accept the golden statue, the entire room arose in a standing ovation. It wasn't just recognition for one role. It was a tribute to an entire long journey filled with pain, failure, and perseverance. Pacino had once stood at the peak, been criticized, been seen as finished, but now he stood before the world with a victory few thought would happen. Many critics later called it one of the greatest comebacks in Hollywood history, not because Pacino had been gone so long, but because he returned stronger than ever. He didn't just prove he was still an excellent actor. He proved that true talent isn't erased by time or failure. For Pacino, the Oscar statue wasn't just an award. It was proof that the hard years, the doubts, and the seemingly meaningless silences in his career had ultimately led to something greater. And as he left the stage that night, Pacino knew his story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes even a legend has to walk through darkness before the real light returns. The victory at the Oscars with his role in Scent of a Woman seemed to close a long, turbulent chapter in Al Pacino's life. After years of ups and downs, he stood again at the peak of Hollywood, honored as a living legend. But Pacino's life had never truly followed a smooth path, and just a few years after that win, another unexpected shock appeared. This time not from critics or the box office, but from the very people he had trusted. Pacino discovered that his accountant, who had managed his finances for many years, had embezzled a massive amount of money. For a long time, Pacino had paid little attention to financial details. He was an artist, first a man, who devoted most of his time and energy to scripts, characters, and the stage. Money matters were left to others, but that very trust cost him dearly. As the truth slowly came to light, Pacino realized that millions of dollars were gone. The money he had earned through years of hard work in film and theater had been nearly drained without his knowledge. For someone who had grown up in poverty like Pacino, that shock wasn't just financial. It struck a deep fear he had always carried, the fear that everything could vanish in an instant. Just like what he had witnessed in his childhood, many assumed a Hollywood star with a career as great as Pacino's would never have to worry about money. But the reality was far more complicated. The life of a movie star came with huge expenses, investments, and financial responsibilities the public rarely saw. When that large sum disappeared, Pacino was forced to make a practical decision. He had to work more. In the years that followed, Pacino took on more roles than before. Some projects came because of his fame, some for artistic opportunities, but there were also films he accepted simply to rebuild his financial stability. That didn't mean Pacino lost his passion for acting, but for the first time in years, his work carried a different pressure, the pressure of recovering what had been taken. Those close to Pacino said the financial shock made him think more about trust and the fragility of success. He had been through too many upheavals in life to believe anything was permanent. Fame could come and go. Money could appear and disappear. But the one thing Pacino knew for sure was his ability in the art of acting. And so, instead of collapsing under that betrayal, he returned to what had always saved him throughout his life: his work. He kept making films, kept stepping onto stages, kept bringing complex characters that audiences couldn't forget. But the event left a deep wound, not because of the money lost, but because of the broken trust. Pacino had survived poverty, years when Hollywood turned its back, the pressures of fame, and the loneliness of success. but being betrayed by someone he trusted was a different kind of pain, quiet but profound. And once again, Pacino was forced to do what he had done his entire life: stand up, keep moving forward, and prove that even when losing so much, he still had the most important thing: himself. After the financial shock and the years of non-stop work to stabilize his life, Al Pacino gradually entered a different phase of his life, a phase where the lights of Hollywood were no longer the sole center. As he grew older, Pacino began to see life in a different way. If before he had devoted most of his time to film and theater, now something else became more important: family. Pacino was never a man who lived by the traditional Hollywood mold. He never married, and, for many years, his private life was kept tightly guarded. But what few people know is that Pacino always held a special affection for his children. His first child was Julie Marie Pacino, born in 1989. When Julie came into the world, Pacino experienced fatherhood for the first time. For a man who had grown up in a broken family, that moment carried special meaning. Pacino once said that watching his daughter grow up helped him understand more deeply the responsibility and connection he had lacked in his own childhood. Many years later, Pacino's life continued to change when he had twin children with actress Beverly D'Angelo, Anton James Pacino, and Olivia Rose Pacino. The arrival of Anton and Olivia brought a new energy into his life. Those close to him said that Pacino, often known for his serious and quiet demeanor, became completely different around his kids. He could spend hours talking, telling stories, and listening to them, as if trying to make up for what he never had as a child. But Pacino's life has always been full of surprises, and one of the biggest came in 2023, at the age of 83, an age when many people have entered the resting phase of life. Pacino welcomed his fourth child, a boy named Roman Pacino. The news quickly shocked Hollywood and media around the world. Many couldn't believe that one of cinema's greatest legends had become a father at 83. But for Pacino, the event wasn't shocking. It was a profound reminder of life. In the rare interviews that followed, Pacino shared that having a child at this late stage of life made him think a great deal. When he was younger, he was often swept up in work, fame, and the pressures of the film industry. Time seemed to slip away too quickly, but seeing a tiny new life begin its journey, Pacino felt more clearly than ever the value of every moment. Becoming a father at 83 wasn't the same as becoming one at 30 or 40. It carried a feeling that was both miraculous and fragile. Pacino understood that time was no longer infinite. Because of that, he began to look at life with a different gaze, slower, deeper, and more appreciative. For a man who had been through so many ups and downs, from poverty in the Bronx to the heights of Hollywood, becoming a father again felt like closing a circle. It reminded him that life isn't measured only by awards or immortal roles, but also by the people we leave behind. And in the later years of that long journey, Pacino seemed to understand that his greatest legacy wasn't just on screen, but in the eyes of the children who looked at him as a father. But even as life seemed to enter calmer years, another moment arrived to remind Al Pacino that no one escapes the fragility of being human. In recent years, when the world faced the COVID-19 pandemic, Pacino was no exception to that storm. In his 80s, his body was no longer as strong as before, and the virus struck him in a way that even surprised him. Later, Pacino recounted that there was a moment during his illness when everything around him seemed to vanish. Doctors and medical staff rushed around the room, but for a few minutes, he had no pulse, no clear heartbeat, no response. For those present, it was a terrifying second, a moment when they weren't sure if the cinema legend the world knew would ever come back. Pacino later said the experience was unlike anything he had ever imagined about death. No bright light, no strange visions, just a sudden void, a profound silence as if everything had paused. And then, somehow, his body started working again. His heart beat again. His breath returned. And Pacino, who had lived through dozens of dramatic roles on screen, returned once more to real life. When he recovered from the illness, he began thinking deeply about that moment. Throughout his life, Pacino had played countless characters, facing death maya bosses, soldiers, rebels, people standing on the edge between life and death. But facing death in real life was something entirely different. For the first time, Pacino clearly felt that his life, no matter how great it appeared to the public, was as fragile as any other human's. He once said that when you pass 80, death is no longer a distant idea. It becomes a quiet presence, like a shadow always somewhere behind you. But that near-death experience didn't frighten Pacino the way many might imagine. Instead, it made him think more deeply about the meaning of his life. He looked back on the long journey from the poor streets of the Bronx, the wandering years in New York, the roles that changed cinema history, the failures, the losses, the times he stood up when it seemed everything had ended. And he began to wonder what would truly remain when all the stage lights went out. Pacino understood that fame is fragile. The applause would eventually fade. The films would become memories of an era. But there was one thing he hoped would last longer: the legacy of an artist who had spent his entire life searching for truth in every character he embodied. For Pacino, acting had never been just a profession. It was how he understood the world, how he understood himself. And after that near-death experience, he realized even more that what mattered wasn't how many roles he had played, but the emotions those roles left in the hearts of audiences. That was something time could hardly erase. So when Pacino looked to the future after his illness, he didn't talk much about fear. Instead, he spoke of gratitude for still being here, for still having the chance to watch his children grow, for still having the opportunity to step onto a stage again if his heart desired. And perhaps after everything he had been through, Pacino understood that his life had never been just a story of success or failure. It was a story of survival. And this time, once again, he had survived. And when looking back on that entire journey, one finally understands that Al Pacino's life was never simply a story of fame or success. It is a story of survival. Survival through poverty, survival through loss, survival through periods when the whole world believed he had vanished. Pacino was never the perfect image Hollywood likes to build. He was not a man who always won. He grew up in hardship amid the harsh streets of the Bronx, where a boy's future was often decided by circumstances rather than dreams. He was once a lost young man, dropping out of school, drinking, and wandering the city with no idea where his life was headed. He lost his mother at 21, a shock that nearly destroyed his world. He once slept on friends' sofas and took small jobs just to survive in New York. And even after becoming a movie star, Pacino never escaped the shadows of his life. He battled alcohol. He felt lonely amid the lights of fame. He endured painful failures when Hollywood turned its back after the film revolution. He was betrayed financially and lost millions of dollars to people he trusted. And there were moments in his life when Pacino truly thought everything he had built could collapse at any time. But what makes Pacino's story different is not those hardships. What makes it special is the way he rose after every fall. Because every time life knocked him down, Pacino always returned to what had saved him from the beginning: the art of acting. On screen, he created characters audiences could never forget. Michael Corleone, the quiet but powerful man, a soul torn between family and power. Tony Montana, a rebellious man full of ambition who climbed to the top through rage and ultimately collapsed in the world he created. Frank Slade, a bitter, blind soldier who still held on to his last shred of dignity. Those characters were not just roles. They were deeply conflicted people, souls carrying pain and the will to survive. And perhaps because Pacino understood that pain so well in real life, he could bring it to the screen with such raw authenticity. Over decades, Pacino did more than make movies. He changed the way acting was perceived in cinema. He brought a style of performance that was profound, introspective, and intense, one that later generations of actors would learn from. His silent gazes could say more than an entire page of script. His explosive moments could make an entire theater hold its breath, and that is why Pacino became not just a star, but a standard. But perhaps what makes Pacino's story most moving is not the awards, not the immortal roles, but the man behind it all. A man who has passed 80 and still looks at the world with the curiosity of an artist. A man who once nearly lost everything yet continued to work, to create, to believe that art could give meaning to life. When Pacino reflects on the journey from a poor boy in the Bronx to a Hollywood legend, he doesn't talk much about glory. He talks about perseverance, about the years when no one believed in him, about the times when it seemed everything had ended. Because if there is one thing Pacino's life proves, it is that legends are not made by easy victories. Legends are made by those who refuse to give up. And so, when the lights of Hollywood one day fade, when the films become memories for generations of audiences, Pacino's story will still be told, not just for the characters he created, but for the man he became. An imperfect man. A man who once lost his way. A man who stood many times before the darkness of his own life and still kept walking. And perhaps that is why the name Al Pacino will always be remembered. Because some legends are remembered for the roles they played, Al Pacino will be remembered for the life he survived. The story of Al Pacino is not just the journey of a movie star, but also a painful portrait of a human being who had to walk through so much darkness before becoming a legend. When looking back on his entire life, it is hard not to feel heartbroken, remembering that the man who created great characters like Michael Corleone in The Godfather or Tony Montana in Scarface was once just a poor boy growing up on harsh streets of the Bronx. He lost his mother at 21, a shock that nearly destroyed his life and pushed him into years of being lost, drinking, and wandering in New York. Even after becoming a star, Pacino still faced events that could have broken many others. The film Revolution in 1985 was heavily criticized, leading him to leave Hollywood for nearly 4 years, and later his own accountant embezzled millions of dollars from him. But what makes Pacino's story so admirable is not that he never failed, but that he never let those failures define him. He came back strong with Scent of a Woman to win the Oscar, proving that true talent cannot be erased by time or mistakes. For the American people, Pacino's story carries a very profound meaning. It reminds us that the American dream is not an easy path to glory, but a long journey of people who dare to stand up after every fall. From a poor boy in the Bronx to a global cinema icon, Pacino shows that willpower, perseverance, and loyalty to passion can take a person farther than any circumstance. And perhaps the greatest lesson from his life is this: true success does not lie in never failing, but in continuing to walk forward even when the whole world believes your story has ended. If the story of Al Pacino's painful yet resilient journey moves you, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring legendary lives behind the lights of Hollywood together. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we will keep telling stories about people who survived adversity to become icons.